The ticking of the mahogany grandfather clock in the hallway had always been a comfort to Eleanor. It was a steady, rhythmic heartbeat in an apartment that had grown far too quiet over the last 15 years. At 68, Eleanor had learned that silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence of memories. She sat in her worn floral armchair by the window, the soft afternoon light casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floor. In her lap lay a half-finished sweater, knit from the softest merino wool in a deep, vibrant shade of navy blue. It was for Leo, her 8-year-old grandson. She smiled softly, her worn, graceful fingers moving with practiced ease, the knitting needles clicking in a familiar cadence. Leo had Arthur's eyes, a piercing, intelligent hazel that always seemed to be searching for a story. Eleanor loved the holidays. For her, Christmas wasn't about the tinsel or the price tags on the gifts under the tree. It was about the scent of cinnamon and baking apples, the warmth of the hearth, and the feeling of being surrounded by the people who tethered you to the earth. She glanced toward the kitchen. On the counter sat the ingredients for her mother's legendary apple pie, a recipe that had survived the Great Depression, 3 wars, and countless family gatherings. She had spent the morning carefully peeling Granny Smith and Honeycrisp apples, preparing the lattice crust just the way Thomas, her son, had loved since he was a little boy. The sharp, jarring ring of the telephone shattered the afternoon quiet. Eleanor carefully set her knitting aside, smoothing the wool, and walked over to the landline in the kitchen. She still preferred the landline. There was a weight to the receiver that felt grounding. "Hello?" she answered, her voice warm. "Hey, Mom." It was Thomas, but the tone of his voice made Eleanor's chest tighten instantly. After 40 years of mothering this man, she knew every inflection, every pause, every sigh. He sounded rushed, breathless, and carrying a heavy load of guilt. "Thomas, sweetheart," she said, leaning against the kitchen counter, her eyes resting on the bowl of peeled apples. "I was just getting ready to bake the pie. The house smells like a bakery. How are you? How is Leo?" "Leo's great, Mom. He's good," Thomas stammered. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Eleanor could hear the muffled sound of a television in the background, and then the distinct sharp click of high heels on a hardwood floor. Jessica. "Thomas?" Eleanor prompted gently. "Is everything all right?" "Mom, listen, I'm calling about Christmas Eve." He let out a long, ragged exhale. "We need to talk about the dinner." "Of course," Eleanor said, keeping her voice light, though a cold knot began to form in her stomach. "I have the sweater almost finished for Leo, and I was planning on bringing the pie, and perhaps those little sausage rolls Jessica likes." "Actually, Mom, that's the thing." Thomas cut her off, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if he were afraid of being overheard in his own home. "We're doing things a little differently this year. Jessica's firm just landed a massive account, and my VP is flying into town. We've decided to turn Christmas Eve into a networking event. We're hosting some senior partners, some people from Jessica's country club." Eleanor blinked. The kitchen suddenly felt very cold. "A networking event? On Christmas Eve?" "I know it sounds crazy, Mom, but it's crucial for my promotion. Jessica has hired a caterer. It's going to be very formal. Black tie, a string quartet, a curated tasting menu." "I have a nice black dress, Thomas," Eleanor said quietly. Her hand tightened around the phone cord. "I wouldn't get in the way. I just want to see Leo open his present." "Mom, please don't make this harder than it is," Thomas sighed. The exasperation in his voice felt like a physical slap. "It's not just about the dress. It's the atmosphere. Jessica's parents are coming, and you know how they are. They expect a certain standard, a certain kind of conversation. We're going to be talking about stock portfolios and European real estate. You'd be bored to tears. And frankly, Jessica is stressed enough about the catering without having to worry about family dynamics." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She wasn't just being uninvited. She was being erased. She was being told in no uncertain terms that she was a liability, an embarrassment, a remnant of a simple, unglamorous past that Jessica was desperately trying to scrub clean, and that her own son was too weak to defend. She thought of the years she had spent working double shifts as a bookkeeper after Arthur passed away, making sure Thomas could graduate from that expensive business school without debt. She thought of the countless weekends she had babysat Leo so Thomas and Jessica could go on their luxury vacations. She thought of the way Jessica always looked at her floral couch, her sensible shoes, her thrift store cardigans with a thinly veiled expression of pity and disgust. "I see," Eleanor finally managed to say. Her voice did not shake. She possessed a quiet, ironclad dignity that she would not allow them to strip away over the telephone. "Mom, I'm sorry," Thomas pleaded, though he sounded more relieved than remorseful. "We'll come by on the 26th, just for an hour or so in the morning. We can exchange gifts then. You can give Leo the sweater." The 26th, the day after the magic, the leftover day. "Don't worry about it, Thomas," Eleanor said, her voice eerily calm and resonant. "You focus on your career. I wouldn't want to disrupt Jessica's perfect evening with my apple pie." "Mom." "Goodbye, Thomas. Have a Merry Christmas." She hung up the phone before he could reply. For a long time, Eleanor stood motionless in the kitchen. She looked at the bowl of apples. They were beginning to brown at the edges. Suddenly, the smell of cinnamon made her feel entirely sick. She reached out, her hands trembling slightly, and picked up the bowl. With a quiet, heartbreaking finality, she tipped the contents into the trash can. She walked into the living room and sank back into her armchair. She didn't cry. The pain was too deep, too hollow for tears. It was an ache in her marrow, a profound realization that she had outlived her usefulness in her own child's life. She was just the old woman in the modest apartment, a ghost haunting the edges of their glossy, high-definition lives. To distract herself from the crushing weight in her chest, Eleanor decided to go downstairs to check the mail. It was a mundane task, something to force her body into motion. The December air in the lobby was crisp. She opened her small brass mailbox and pulled out a stack of envelopes. Most of it was junk, circulars for grocery stores, a few holiday cards from distant acquaintances, the electric bill. But at the bottom of the stack was a thick, cream-colored envelope made of heavy, expensive paper. The return address read, Sterling, Vance & Howell, Corporate Law and Estate Management. Eleanor frowned. She hadn't dealt with a lawyer since finalizing Arthur's meager estate 15 years ago. She took the elevator back up to her apartment, her curiosity momentarily cutting through the fog of her grief. Sitting at her small oak dining table, she carefully sliced the envelope open with a butter knife. Inside were several pages of dense legal text, accompanied by a cover letter printed on thick, watermarked letterhead. She pulled her reading glasses down from her head and began to read. Dear Mrs. Eleanor Vance, we are writing to you in our capacity as the legal representatives handling the legacy assets of the late Mr. Arthur Vance. During a recent audit of dormant accounts following a major corporate acquisition, we uncovered an outstanding asset registered in your late husband's name, for which you are the sole listed beneficiary. Eleanor stopped reading and rubbed her temples. Arthur had been a high school science teacher, a wonderful, brilliant, loving man, but they had lived paycheck to paycheck their entire marriage. What legacy assets could they possibly be talking about? She continued down the page. In 2004, Mr. Vance purchased 15,000 shares of a highly speculative startup called Helios Green Tech. As you may be aware, the company remained private and relatively obscure for nearly 2 decades. However, last month, Helios was acquired by a major international energy conglomerate. Eleanor's breath hitched. She vaguely remembered Arthur talking excitedly about a solar panel company years ago, investing a small bonus he had received. She had teased him about throwing money at a pipe dream, but she had let him do it because it made him happy. They had promptly forgotten about it. Her eyes moved to the next paragraph, to the bolded numbers at the center of the page. Due to the aggressive terms of the acquisition and the subsequent stock split over the years, the current liquid value of these shares is substantial. Enclosed are the documents required to transfer the funds to your personal accounts. The total post-tax disbursement value amounts to $5,140,000 US. Eleanor dropped the letter. It fluttered to the hardwood floor like a dead leaf. She stared at the space where the paper had been, her mind entirely blank. $5,140,000. It was a mistake. It had to be a cruel, bureaucratic mistake. She picked the paper back up, her hands shaking violently now. She read it again, and again. She looked at the contact numbers, the official seals, the precise legal language. She slowly stood up and walked over to the mantelpiece, where a framed photograph of Arthur stood. He was smiling, his arms slung around her shoulders on a beach trip they had taken 30 years ago. Arthur, she whispered into the empty room. What on earth did you do? She sank onto the sofa, The letter clutched to her chest. $5 million. It was more money than she could comprehend. It was a sum that altered the very fabric of reality. And then, the strangest thing happened. Eleanor began to laugh. It started as a soft chuckle, bubbling up from the depths of her chest, and soon turned into a full, resonant laugh that brought tears to her eyes. The tears spilled over, hot and fast, tracking through the delicate lines on her face. She was laughing at the profound, bitter irony of the universe. Not an hour ago, she had been discarded by her son and daughter-in-law because she wasn't refined enough, because she didn't fit into their world of wealth and status. She was just the poor, invisible mother, and all this time, sitting quietly in a lawyer's filing cabinet, was a fortune that Jessica would have sold her soul for. Eleanor stopped laughing. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. The sorrow that had paralyzed her earlier was gone, replaced by a sudden, fierce clarity. A fire that had been banked and smoldering for 15 years suddenly caught the wind and flared to life. She looked around her small, cozy apartment. She didn't want a mansion in Palm Beach. She didn't want sports cars or diamonds. She didn't want the cold, soulless life that Jessica was chasing. But for the first time in her life, Eleanor had power. Absolute, undeniable power. She walked over to her writing desk and opened her laptop. She thought of Thomas, trying to impress men in tailored suits with plates of expensive, tasteless food. She thought of Leo, wandering around a formal party, told to keep his voice down and not touch the crystal. She thought of how Jessica had systematically, year by year, pruned the undesirable branches from the family tree. If they want a high society Christmas, Eleanor thought, her jaw setting in a firm line, let them have it. I am going to have a real one. She opened a search engine and began typing. She didn't look for beach resorts or luxury cruises. She typed, exclusive private mountain lodges for rent, Colorado. She clicked through pages of stunning properties until she found it. The Timberline Estate in Aspen. It wasn't just a cabin. It was a sprawling, magnificent timber-framed lodge set against a backdrop of snow-capped peaks. It had a massive stone fireplace, a chef's kitchen, 10 bedrooms, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a private pine forest. It cost more for 1 week than Eleanor used to make in a year. She found the contact number for the concierge service and dialed. Timberline Concierge, this is Marcus. How may I assist you? A polished voice answered. Hello, Marcus. My name is Eleanor Vance. I would like to book the estate for the week of Christmas. I'm sorry, ma'am, Marcus said politely. We are fully booked for the holiday season. The wait list is quite— Marcus, Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying a quiet authority she didn't know she possessed. I am prepared to wire the full amount plus a 50% premium immediately, and I will need a full staff. A chef who knows how to make a proper roast, decorators to fill the place with real pine and lights, and someone to arrange private transportation from the Denver airport for my guests. There was a pause on the line, the sound of rapid typing. Let me speak to the property manager, Mrs. Vance. I believe we might have a sudden cancellation. 20 minutes later, the lodge was hers. Eleanor closed the laptop. Her heart was beating a steady, powerful rhythm. She pulled a fresh legal pad from her drawer and picked up a pen. At the top of the page, she wrote, The Real Christmas. Now for the guest list. She didn't write down the names of anyone who would be at Jessica's party. Instead, she began to list the people who had been left behind. She wrote down Martha, her husband's cousin. Martha was a retired school bus driver with a booming laugh who always brought a cheap, overly sweet fruitcake to gatherings. Jessica had stopped inviting her 3 years ago, claiming Martha was too loud and didn't know how to use the proper silverware. She wrote down Uncle Joe, a retired mechanic who always smelled faintly of motor oil and peppermint. Jessica had banned him after he accidentally tracked a bit of mud onto her white Persian rug. She wrote down Sarah and her kids. Sarah was Eleanor's niece, a single mother struggling to make ends meet, whose children were deemed too unruly for Jessica's pristine house. Then Eleanor paused. A brilliant, mischievous thought crossed her mind. She wrote down one more name, Maria. Maria was the warm, loving, older Hispanic woman who had been Leo's nanny for the first 4 years of his life. Leo had adored her. But Jessica had abruptly fired Maria because she had caught her letting Leo eat a fast food hamburger and watching cartoons instead of feeding him organic kale puree and playing Mozart. Eleanor knew Maria had been heartbroken. Eleanor looked at the list. 15 people. 15 people who were genuine, who laughed loudly, who loved fiercely, and who knew that the true meaning of the holidays was connection, not performance. She picked up the phone again and dialed the first number. "Martha? It's Eleanor. How would you like to go to Aspen for Christmas?" The telephone calls Eleanor made that evening were a symphony of disbelief, tears, and overwhelming joy. When she dialed Martha's number, she could hear the chaotic sounds of a television game show blaring in the background. Martha, Arthur's cousin, lived in a cramped duplex on the other side of town. When Eleanor extended the invitation, an all-expenses-paid trip to a private lodge in Aspen for Christmas, Martha dropped the baking tin she was holding. It hit the linoleum floor with a loud clatter. "Eleanor Vance, have you lost your mind?" Martha gasped, her booming, raspy voice echoing through the receiver. "Aspen? Colorado? I haven't been on an airplane since 1998. And how on earth can you afford—" "Arthur left us a little surprise, Martha," Eleanor said softly, smiling at the phone. "A long-term investment that finally matured. And I can't think of a better way to honor his memory than by gathering the people who actually know how to laugh. Bring your fruitcake, the one Jessica hates. I insist." Martha burst into loud, unapologetic tears. "I'll start packing my sensible boots right now." Next was Uncle Joe. He answered the phone with a gruff, tired, "Hello," probably exhausted from a long day at the auto shop. When Eleanor told him the plan, there was a long, heavy silence. "Ellie," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to do this. I know Thomas's wife doesn't like having me around. I'm just a greasy old mechanic. I don't want to ruin your holiday." "Joe, you are my husband's brother. You taught Thomas how to ride a bicycle. You are family," Eleanor said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "There is a grand piano at this lodge, and I expect you to play Oh Holy Night for us, even if you miss a few keys. You are coming." She called Sarah, her niece, who wept openly, confessing she had been trying to figure out how to explain to her 3 young children why Santa might not bring many presents this year. Eleanor assured her that Santa had simply rerouted his sleigh to the Rocky Mountains. But the most emotional call was to Maria. When Maria heard Eleanor's voice, she immediately asked about Leo. "How is my little Angelito? Is he eating well? Does he still like the books about the dinosaurs?" "He misses you terribly, Maria," Eleanor said, a lump forming in her own throat. "And so do I, which is why I need you to pack a warm coat." When Eleanor explained the trip, Maria sobbed in a mix of Spanish and English, thanking God and blessing Eleanor a dozen times over. Maria had been entirely cast aside by Jessica, treated like disposable help rather than the warm, beating heart of Leo's early childhood. Bringing her back into the fold felt like stitching a torn piece of fabric back together. Within 48 hours, Eleanor's quiet, lonely life had transformed into a whirlwind of purposeful action. She didn't want her guests dealing with the stress of commercial airports during the holiday rush. With a few phone calls to her new wealth management advisor, she chartered a mid-sized private jet. When the fleet of black cars picked up her guests and brought them to the private tarmac on the morning of December 23rd, the looks on their faces were priceless. Uncle Joe stood frozen, staring at the sleek aircraft, his worn duffel bag clutched in his hands. Sarah's children were bouncing with uncontainable energy, their eyes wide with wonder. Martha arrived wearing a bright red bedazzled Christmas sweater, clutching a giant tin of her infamous fruitcake as if it were the crown jewels. Eleanor stood at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, wearing a tailored navy wool coat and a simple pearl necklace. She looked radiant. The weight of the past 15 years seemed to have evaporated from her shoulders. As she hugged each of them, she didn't feel like a discarded old woman. She felt like a matriarch. The flight to Colorado was filled with loud, joyous laughter, the popping of sparkling cider, and the sharing of old stories. But the true magic began when the private shuttles wound their way up the snow-covered mountain roads of Aspen and finally pulled through the massive iron gates of the Timberline estate. The lodge was a masterpiece of rustic luxury. Giant timber logs formed the walls, and the roof was blanketed in pristine, untouched snow. As the staff opened the heavy wooden doors, the scent of fresh pine, roasting meats, and wood smoke washed over them. In the center of the great room, beneath a vaulted ceiling, stood a 15-foot Douglas fir, glittering with thousands of warm white lights and classic glass ornaments. A fire roared in a stone hearth the size of a small car. The chef, a warm, burly man named Chef David, came out of the kitchen wiping his hands on his apron, offering them trays of hot cocoa with homemade marshmallows and warm, spiced cider. There was no stiffness here. There was no dress code. Within an hour, Sarah's kids were rolling around on the thick plush rugs in their thick socks. Uncle Joe was marveling at the architecture, running his calloused hands over the custom woodwork. Martha had already befriended the kitchen staff and was negotiating a space in the massive double ovens to heat up her fruitcake. Eleanor stood on the sweeping wooden balcony, looking out over the private snow-draped pine forest. The cold mountain air bit at her cheeks, but her heart was incredibly warm. She pressed her hand to the wooden railing. "Thank you, Arthur," she thought. "Thank you for giving me the power to bring them home." 2,000 miles away, in a sleek, ultra-modern neighborhood in the suburbs, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was the evening of Christmas Eve. Jessica and Thomas's house was a monument to minimalist monochromatic design. Everything was white, slate gray, and polished chrome. The Christmas tree was a stark silver artificial fir, decorated strictly with matte black and silver geometric shapes. It looked less like a holiday centerpiece and more like an art installation in a corporate lobby. Jessica was pacing the kitchen in a tight emerald green silk dress, her phone pressed to her ear, snapping at the catering manager. "I explicitly said the beluga caviar needs to be served on mother-of-pearl spoons, not stainless steel. Stainless steel ruins the flavor profile," she hissed, her manicured nails tapping frantically against the marble island. "And the endive boats look wilted. Fix it. Mr. Sterling is arriving in 20 minutes. Thomas stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, pulling uncomfortably at the collar of his tuxedo. His stomach was tied in tight, painful knots. He had taken a mild antacid 20 minutes ago, but the burning sensation in his chest refused to subside. He pulled out his phone and stared at the blank screen. He had texted his mother that morning. "Merry Christmas Eve, Mom. Hope you're having a relaxing night. See you on the 26th. She hadn't replied. Eleanor always replied, usually with a string of heart emojis and a picture of whatever she was baking. The silence from her end felt heavy, like an unspoken accusation. A wave of profound guilt washed over him. He thought of her sitting alone in her small apartment, probably watching a black and white movie, eating a simple dinner while he prepared to schmooze men he didn't even like. "Thomas, stop slouching," Jessica snapped, walking past him and adjusting his bow tie with a sharp tug. "You look miserable. Please tell me you've memorized the talking points about the overseas expansion. Sterling loves to talk about emerging markets." "I know the talking points, Jess," Thomas muttered, rubbing his temples. I feel bad about Mom." Jessica rolled her eyes, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "Thomas, we talked about this. It's one night. Your mother doesn't understand this world. If she were here, she'd try to force homemade sausage rolls onto the CEO of a Fortune 500 company and talk about her knitting club. She'd be miserable, and we'd be embarrassed. We are doing this for our future. For Leo's future." At the mention of his name, Thomas looked over to the corner of the living room. Leo was sitting stiffly on a modern, uncomfortable accent chair. He was wearing a miniature tuxedo that scratched his neck. His iPad was resting on his lap, but he wasn't playing any games. He just looked sad. "Hey, buddy." Thomas walked over, crouching down. "You okay?" Leo looked up, his hazel eyes, Arthur's eyes, filled with quiet disappointment. "I miss Grandma. She said she was making me a blue sweater, and she always smells like cinnamon. It smells like cleaner in here." Thomas swallowed hard. "I know, pal. We'll see her the day after tomorrow." "Why couldn't she come today?" Leo asked innocently. "Is it because she's not fancy enough?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to explain, to offer some sanitized adult excuse, but the doorbell rang, a sharp melodic chime that signaled the beginning of the performance. "They're here," Jessica whispered sharply, her face instantly transforming into a mask of radiant practiced charm. "Thomas, game face. Leo, go to your room and watch a movie. Do not come down until I send for you." Leo dutifully slid off the chair and marched up the stairs, his small shoulders slumped. Thomas watched his son retreat, the bitter taste of regret lingering in his mouth as he turned to greet his boss. The party was exactly as Eleanor had predicted, a flawless, soulless exhibition. The string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner, but the music was drowned out by the hollow chatter of stock options, real estate acquisitions, and golf handicaps. The guests, draped in designer clothing, picked at the tiny artistic appetizers with polite indifference. Thomas stood near the fireplace, nursing a glass of scotch he didn't really want, nodding mechanically as Mr. Sterling, a large, imposing man with a booming voice, lectured him about corporate synergy. Thomas felt entirely disconnected from his own body. He looked at his wife across the room. Jessica was laughing loudly at a joke made by a senior partner's wife, her eyes darting around the room to ensure everyone was noticing how perfectly she hosted. There was no warmth. There was no joy. There was only the exhausting, relentless pursuit of being perceived as important. Meanwhile, in Aspen, the volume was steadily rising. Dinner had been a magnificent, chaotic affair. Instead of tiny, curated plates, Chef David had prepared a family-style feast. There were massive platters of prime rib, mountains of garlic mashed potatoes, roasted winter vegetables, and, standing proudly in the center, Martha's slightly lopsided, overly sweet fruitcake. Nobody talked about the stock market. They talked about the past. Uncle Joe told a hilarious, slightly exaggerated story about the time Arthur tried to fix the plumbing in their first apartment and ended up flooding the hallway. Sarah's kids laughed so hard they snorted milk out of their noses. Eleanor sat at the head of the long, rustic wooden table, wearing an ugly Christmas sweater that featured a reindeer with a light-up red nose, a gift from Martha. Eleanor had never felt richer. After dinner, they migrated to the great room. The kids were roasting marshmallows in the fireplace under Uncle Joe's watchful eye. Martha was snoring softly in a plush armchair, worn out from the altitude and the excitement. Maria sat on a leather sofa near the Christmas tree, a mug of hot cider in her hands. She looked around the room, her heart swelling with gratitude. She pulled out her smartphone. Maria had a modest Instagram account where she usually posted pictures of her baking and her church choir back in Texas. She opened the app and tapped the Live button. Hola, mis amigos, Merry Christmas. Maria beamed into the camera, turning her phone to capture the sprawling, magnificent lodge. I wanted to show you all a miracle. Look at this beautiful place. And look at these beautiful people. She panned the camera around. It caught the towering, glowing tree. It caught Uncle Joe sitting at the grand piano, picking out a jazz version of Jingle Bells. It caught the massive windows showcasing the moonlit, snow-covered mountains. Finally, Maria turned the camera to Eleanor, who was sitting near the fire, her eyes crinkling with genuine happiness. This is Mrs. Eleanor, Maria said to her viewers, her voice thick with emotion. She is an angel on earth. She brought us all together when we thought we would be alone. This is what real family looks like. This is what Christmas is. Eleanor looked up at the camera and smiled warmly, waving a hand. Merry Christmas, everyone. Hold your loved ones close. Maria ended the broadcast, saving the video to her profile. She tagged the location, Timberline Estate, Aspen, Colorado. She added a few hashtags and pressed post. What Maria didn't know was that the internet is a very small, deeply interconnected place. She didn't know that Jessica's wealthy country club friends, who frequently hired Maria's sister for catering back in Texas, followed her account. And she certainly didn't know that Chloe Sterling, the 20-something daughter of Thomas's boss, who was currently bored out of her mind at Jessica's sterile networking party, was scrolling through her Instagram feed while hiding in Jessica's pristine downstairs powder room. Chloe refreshed her feed. A video popped up. She tapped it, and the sound of roaring fires, jazz piano, and genuine booming laughter filled the quiet bathroom. Chloe's eyes widened as she looked at the magnificent timber lodge, the joyous faces, and finally, the elegant older woman waving at the camera. Chloe paused the video. She walked out of the powder room, holding her phone up, and headed straight toward her father, who was still lecturing Thomas by the fireplace. The match had been struck. The powder keg was about to blow. Chloe Sterling did not care about corporate synergy, and she certainly did not care about the microscopic portions of beluga caviar. She was 24, working at an art gallery in the city, and was only at this stifling suburban party because her father had promised to pay off her remaining student loans if she made an appearance. She walked out of the powder room, the bright screen of her phone illuminating her face in the dimly lit hallway. She navigated through the clusters of people in tailored suits and silk dresses, heading straight for the fireplace where her father, Arthur Sterling, was holding court. Thomas stood beside him, looking like a man who was quietly enduring a root canal. "Dad," Chloe interrupted, ignoring the slight widening of her father's eyes at her breach of etiquette. She held out her phone. "You have to see this. I think this is the lodge in Aspen you were trying to rent for us last year, the Timberline Estate." Mr. Sterling, a man who commanded boardrooms with a mere clearing of his throat, paused. He loved Aspen. He loved real estate even more. He took the phone from his daughter, adjusting his reading glasses. Thomas politely leaned over to glance at the screen, expecting to see a standard real estate tour. Instead, the first thing he saw was the unmistakable broad face of his Uncle Joe, laughing uproariously while wearing a paper crown. Thomas's heart slammed against his ribs, skipping a beat before taking off at a frantic gallop. "Wait a minute," Thomas breathed, leaning closer, the scotch in his hand sloshing precariously. On the small screen, a vibrant, chaotic, and unimaginably joyous Christmas party was unfolding. The audio was a mix of jazz piano, crackling fire, and genuine laughter. The camera panned across a massive log cabin living room that Thomas recognized from luxury travel magazines. It caught Sarah's kids running around. It caught Martha, asleep in a chair with a half-eaten piece of fruitcake on her lap. And then, the camera turned to the woman sitting by the fire. She was wearing a ridiculous sweater with a light-up reindeer nose. Her face was glowing, stripped of the quiet melancholy that had haunted her for the last 15 years. She looked vibrant. She looked like a queen holding court in a mountain fortress. "Is that—" Thomas choked on the words. "Mom? Mr." Sterling looked up from the phone, his thick eyebrows knitting together in confusion. He looked at Thomas, then looked across the room at Jessica, who was currently fake laughing at a joke by the hors d'oeuvres table. "Your mother, Thomas?" Mr. Sterling's booming voice dropped an octave, cutting through the ambient noise of the room. A few heads turned. "Jessica told my wife that your mother was too frail to travel this year. She said she was resting quietly at an assisted living facility." The color completely drained from Thomas's face. He felt the blood rushing in his ears, a loud, roaring sound that drowned out the string quartet. An assisted living facility. Jessica had lied to the CEO. She had buried Eleanor alive in a fictional nursing home just to avoid answering questions about her absence. Jessica, sensing the shift in the room's energy, gracefully excused herself and glided over to the fireplace. "Is everything all right, Mr. Sterling? Do we need to top off your drink?" Mr. Sterling did not smile. He handed the phone to Jessica. "Your daughter-in-law seems to be having quite the recovery, Jessica. In Aspen, no less. At the Timberline." Jessica looked at the screen. The video had looped back to the beginning. She saw Maria, the nanny she had fired, holding the phone. She saw the cousins she had banned. And she saw Eleanor. Eleanor, who was supposed to be sitting in a drab apartment, crying over a rejected apple pie, was instead toasting to a camera in a living room that cost more per week than Jessica's entire annual household income. Jessica's perfectly powdered face turned a ghastly shade of gray. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The phone slipped from her manicured fingers and fell onto the plush white rug with a soft thud. The silence that followed was suffocating. The string quartet, sensing the sudden tension, awkwardly faded out their rendition of Winter Wonderland. Mr. Sterling looked at Thomas and then at Jessica. There was no anger in his eyes, which somehow made it worse. There was only a profound, heavy disappointment. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was investing in a hollow company. "I've spent the last 2 hours listening to you two talk about prestige, networking, and wealth," Mr. Sterling said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "But I'm looking at that video, and I see a family that knows how to love each other. I see music, and laughter, and warmth." He buttoned his suit jacket, signaling the end of the evening. "You chose to serve me imported fish and talk about profit margins on Christmas Eve, while your own mother, the woman who apparently possesses the true wealth of your family, is celebrating across the country with the people you left behind." Mr. Sterling shook his head. "You have your priorities entirely backward, Thomas. A man who does not honor his own mother is not a man I can trust to honor a corporate contract." "Sir, please let me explain," Thomas started, stepping forward, his hands trembling. "Don't!" Mr. Sterling held up a hand. "Chloe, get your coat. We're leaving. Thank you for the, catering, Jessica." As the CEO of the firm walked out the front door, the rest of the party collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. The senior partners, their wives, the country club acquaintances, they all murmured hasty apologies, suddenly remembering imaginary emergencies or early morning flights. Within 15 minutes, the house was entirely empty, save for Thomas, Jessica, and the hired waitstaff who were awkwardly clearing away untouched plates of caviar. Thomas stood frozen in the center of his pristine white living room. He felt as though the floor had vanished beneath him. A small sound made him turn. Leo was standing at the top of the stairs. The 8-year-old was clutching his tablet, tears streaming down his face. He had heard the commotion and had watched the entire video on Maria's Instagram page. "You lied!" Leo sobbed, his voice cracking. "Grandma wasn't too tired. She didn't stay home. You didn't let her come. And Maria is there. You said Maria moved far away and didn't want to see me anymore." "Leo, honey, go back to your room," Jessica snapped, her voice shrill with panic and humiliation. She was furiously typing on her phone, trying to do damage control. "Don't you speak to him like that," Thomas roared, a sudden, unfamiliar fury exploding from his chest. He took the stairs 2 at a time, scooping his crying son into his arms and burying his face in Leo's neck. "I'm sorry, buddy. I am so sorry." The morning of December 26th broke gray and bitter cold. The aftermath of the ruined party still lingered in the house. The faint smell of stale wine, wilted floral centerpieces, and a profound, heavy silence. Thomas hadn't slept. He had spent the entire night sitting in the dark in his home office, replaying the last 5 years of his life. He saw the slow, systematic erasure of his mother. He saw the times he had bitten his tongue when Jessica made a cruel remark. He saw the pathetic, cowardly man he had become, sacrificing his own flesh and blood on the altar of his wife's vanity. Jessica finally emerged from the master bedroom around 10 o'clock, wearing a silk robe, her eyes red and puffy. But she didn't look remorseful. She looked like a trapped animal calculating an escape route. "We need a strategy," she said, pacing the kitchen, ignoring the dark circles under Thomas's eyes. "Sterling won't return my emails, but more importantly, we need to find out how your mother pulled this off. The Timberline estate costs $50,000 a week, Thomas. $50,000. Who paid for it? Did she take out a loan just to spite us? Is she trying to ruin us?" Thomas looked at her. It was as if he were seeing a stranger. "That's what you care about?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "My mother is sitting in a mansion in Aspen with our entire extended family. My boss practically fired me in my own living room. Our son cried himself to sleep because we lied to him. And you want a strategy?" "I am trying to fix this," Jessica yelled, her composure finally shattering. "She humiliated us. She did this on purpose to make me look like a fool." "You made yourself look like a fool, Jessica," Thomas said, standing up. "I'm going to my mother's apartment. I need to know what's going on." He grabbed his keys and walked out, ignoring her shrill demands to come back. The drive to Eleanor's neighborhood was a blur. Thomas's mind was racing. How did she afford it? His mother lived on Social Security and a modest pension. She clipped coupons. She bought yarn on sale. The math didn't add up. When he arrived at her brick apartment building, he took the stairs to the 3rd floor. He knocked on the door. Silence. He knocked harder. "Thomas, is that you?" He turned to see Mrs. Higgins, his mother's elderly, fiercely loyal neighbor, peeking out from the door across the hall. "Mrs. Higgins, do you know where my mother is? I know she went to Colorado, but I need to know how. When did she leave?" Mrs. Higgins crossed her arms, looking at him with a mixture of pity and severe disapproval. "She left 2 days ago, in a black town car. Driver carried her bags. Took her to the private airfield, I reckon." "Private airfield?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "Mrs. Higgins, please. Did she win the lottery? Did she take out a reverse mortgage?" The old woman scoffed. "Your mother doesn't gamble, Thomas. But she did get a very thick letter from a fancy law firm the day she left. I brought her mail up for her. Saw the envelope. Sterling, Vance, and Howell. Something to do with your father's old papers," she mumbled to me in the hallway. Thomas froze. The name of the law firm triggered a deeply buried memory. Sterling, Vance, and Howell. They handled corporate acquisitions. And his father's old papers. A memory struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was 15, sitting at the kitchen table. His father, Arthur, was animatedly talking about a startup. Helios Green Tech. "It's the future, Ellie. I put my bonus in. Just wait and see." Thomas pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. He opened a browser and typed in Helios Green Tech. The top news article from 3 weeks ago loaded instantly. Global energy giant acquires Helios Green Tech in blockbuster multi-billion-dollar deal. Early shareholders set for massive windfall. The phone nearly slipped from his grip. He leaned against the hallway wall, the rough plaster scratching through his coat. His mother hadn't taken out a loan. She hadn't gone into debt to spite them. His father's forgotten investment had exploded. Eleanor was a millionaire. She was sitting on a fortune. But the money didn't bring Thomas relief. It brought a wave of nausea so profound he had to squeeze his eyes shut, because he realized the sequence of events. She got the letter the same day he called to cancel Christmas, which meant she hadn't hidden the money from them for years. She had found out she was rich, and she had waited. She had waited to see if her son would invite her into his home out of love, or if she was truly nothing to him without a bank balance to offer. And he had failed the test. He had thrown her away. Thomas stumbled out of the apartment building, gasping for the freezing winter air. He had traded the unconditional love of a multimillionaire mother for the shallow approval of a wife who was destroying his life. When Thomas returned to his pristine, sterile house, Jessica was sitting at the kitchen island, surrounded by legal pads. "I looked up the estate," Jessica said immediately, her eyes feverish. "If she has that kind of money, Thomas, we have to talk to her. We need to secure Leo's inheritance. We need to explain that the networking party was just a misunderstanding. If she's wealthy, she'll understand the need for social climbing." "Stop!" Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. He walked slowly toward her. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. He looked at the expensive marble countertops, the custom cabinetry, the designer dress she was wearing. "Why do you hate her so much, Jessica?" Thomas asked softly. "Really, why? It's not just that she's unfashionable. It's not just that she makes you uncomfortable. You actively tried to erase a sweet, harmless old woman from our lives. Why?" Jessica blinked, taken aback. "I don't hate her. We operate on different levels, Thomas. My family, my background, we have standards to uphold." "Your background," Thomas repeated. He reached across the counter and grabbed a stack of mail that Jessica had been hoarding in a corner drawer. He ripped open a thick envelope. "You mean this background?" He slammed a credit card statement onto the marble. The balance was highlighted in angry red ink. $84,500. Jessica gasped, lunging for the paper, but Thomas held it out of reach. He ripped open another, and another. "You aren't old money, Jessica," Thomas said, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and profound sadness. "Your parents were middle-class salespeople who went bankrupt trying to look rich. I knew that when I married you, and I didn't care. I loved you anyway. But you've spent the last 10 years terrified that someone in this fake plastic society of yours will find out." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes, ruining her meticulous makeup. She backed away against the stove, her chest heaving. "You couldn't stand my mother," Thomas continued relentlessly, "because she is exactly what you are terrified of becoming. She's content. She's happy without the labels. Every time you looked at her, you saw the life you are running from. So you punished her for it. You made her feel small so you could feel big, and you made me help you do it." Jessica broke. A ragged, ugly sob tore from her throat. She slid down the front of the cabinets, collapsing onto the hardwood floor, burying her face in her hands. "I was just trying to protect us," she sobbed, the high society accent vanishing, replaced by the terrified voice of a woman drowning in her own lies. "If they know we're not one of them, they'll chew us up. The debts are suffocating me, Thomas. I just wanted us to be important." Thomas looked down at his wife. He didn't feel the urge to comfort her. He felt nothing but a crushing, exhausting weight. The facade was completely broken. The house of cards had finally collapsed, leaving them standing in the ruins of their own making. "Pack a bag," Thomas said quietly, turning away from her. Jessica looked up, her mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. "What? Where are we going? Are you leaving me?" "No," Thomas said, his voice completely hollow. "We're going to Aspen. We're going to face my mother. And for the first time in your life, Jessica, you are going to tell the truth." The flight to Denver and the subsequent 3-hour drive up the winding, ice-slicked roads of the Rocky Mountains were undertaken in near absolute silence. The expansive, breathtaking vistas of snow-capped peaks passed by the windows of their rental SUV, but neither Thomas nor Jessica noticed. They were trapped in the wreckage of their own making. When they finally reached the massive wrought iron gates of the Timberline estate, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and gold across the snow. Thomas rolled down the window and pressed the intercom button. He stated his name, his voice barely above a whisper. A moment later, the heavy gates swung open. They parked near the front entrance. Thomas turned the engine off. The silence of the mountain was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of their lives back home. He looked over at Jessica. She was wearing a simple, unbranded wool coat, her face devoid of the heavy contouring and bright lipstick she usually wore as armor. She looked small, exhausted, and remarkably human. "Ready?" Thomas asked, though he knew neither of them was. Jessica simply nodded, staring at her hands. They walked up the stone steps. Before Thomas could knock, the heavy wooden door opened. Eleanor stood there. She wasn't wearing the light-up reindeer sweater from the video. She wore a tailored, cream-colored cashmere turtleneck and dark slacks. She looked exactly as she always had, dignified, composed, and quiet. But the context had shifted entirely. She no longer looked like an imposition. She looked like a sovereign. "Thomas, Jessica," Eleanor said softly, stepping aside to let them in. "You had a long drive." "Mom, Thomas choked on the words the moment he saw her. The smell of cinnamon and wood smoke hit him, unlocking a vault of childhood memories he had spent the last decade trying to bury. "Not in the hallway," Eleanor interrupted gently but firmly. "The others are in the East Wing watching a movie. We will speak on the veranda." She led them through the great room. The remnants of the joyful Christmas Thomas had witnessed on the screen were everywhere. Half-finished puzzles on the coffee table, a stack of board games, stockings hung unevenly by the massive stone fireplace. It looked messy. It looked alive. They stepped out onto the sprawling wooden veranda. The freezing mountain air bit at their faces, but the deck was heated, and a large fire pit burned brightly in the center, casting a warm, flickering glow. Eleanor sat down in a cedar Adirondack chair and gestured for them to sit on the sofa opposite her. For a long moment, the only sound was the popping of the fire and the wind rustling through the pine trees. "I received your text message, Thomas," Eleanor began, her voice steady. "The one where you wished me a relaxing night in my apartment while you entertained your corporate executives." Thomas dropped his head into his hands. His shoulders began to shake. The dam finally broke, releasing years of accumulated cowardice and guilt. "I'm so sorry. Mom, I am so incredibly sorry. I was a coward. I let the pursuit of a promotion, of status, blind me to everything that actually matters. I let you be erased from my own son's life because it was easier than fighting for you." He looked up, his face slick with tears. "When I saw that video, when I realized what you had done, I have never hated myself more than I did in that moment. I failed you, completely." Eleanor looked at her son. Her heart ached for him, but she did not reach out to comfort him. The wound needed to be cleaned before it could heal, and that process was inherently painful. "You did fail me, Thomas," she said evenly. "But more importantly, you failed yourself. You traded your integrity for the illusion of importance. You let this house of cards dictate your worth." Eleanor shifted her gaze to Jessica. The younger woman flinched slightly under the older woman's calm, piercing stare. "And you, Jessica," Eleanor said, her tone devoid of the malice Jessica had always expected from her. "For 5 years you have treated me like a disease you were trying to eradicate. You made me feel small, uncultured, and unwelcome in my own family. I want to know why." Jessica gripped the edges of her coat. She opened her mouth to deploy one of her standard polished deflections, to talk about societal expectations or a misunderstanding of tone. But she looked into Eleanor's eyes and realized that the games were over. The truth was the only currency left. "Because I was terrified," Jessica whispered, her voice cracking. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. "I was terrified every single day." She looked down at the wooden deck. "My parents went bankrupt when I was in high school. The repo men came and took our cars, our furniture. We lost everything because my mother couldn't stop buying things to impress people who didn't even like her. I swore I would never let that happen to me. I swore I would build a life that was bulletproof." Jessica let out a bitter, wet laugh. "But I did the exact same thing. I married Thomas, and I pushed him, and spent money we didn't have to build this perfect, wealthy facade. The credit card debt it's almost $90,000. I'm drowning, Eleanor. I haven't slept through the night in 3 years." She finally looked up, meeting Eleanor's gaze with raw, broken honesty. "When I looked at you, I saw a woman who shopped at thrift stores and used coupons. I saw the life I was running from. But the worst part was, you were happy. You had nothing, and you were at peace. I had everything, and I was falling apart. I hated you for that. I tried to push you away because your very existence proved that my entire life was a lie." The cold wind whipped around the veranda, carrying away the last remnants of Jessica's arrogance. She was stripped bare, a frightened girl hiding behind designer labels. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. She looked at the two of them, broken, humbled, and finally honest. "Arthur and I lived a simple life," Eleanor said, her voice softening, taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "We didn't have much money, but we had a wealth of time, of love, of respect for one another. When Arthur bought those shares 20 years ago, it was a shot in the dark, a dream. When the lawyers contacted me and told me it was worth over $5 million, I was shocked." Thomas and Jessica held their breath. "But I didn't hide the money from you to test you, Thomas," Eleanor continued. "I only found out about it the afternoon you called to cancel my Christmas. The universe, it seems, has a very sharp sense of irony." "Mom," Thomas pleaded, leaning forward, "we don't care about the money. I promise you. We just want you back. We want our family back." "I know you mean that right now, Thomas," Eleanor said, "but healing requires more than a tearful apology. It requires action. It requires a fundamental change in how you live." Eleanor stood up and walked over to the railing, looking out at the snow-covered pines. "I forgive you," she said softly, sending a shockwave of relief through Thomas's chest. "Both of you. I release the anger because carrying it only poisons me. But forgiveness does not mean I am going to rescue you from the consequences of your choices." She turned to face them, her posture perfectly straight. "I am not going to pay off your credit card debt, Jessica." Jessica closed her eyes and nodded slowly. "I didn't expect you to." "You are going to sell that massive, sterile house," Eleanor commanded, not unkindly, but with absolute authority. "You are going to sell the luxury cars, the designer watches, the expensive handbags. You will pay off your debts with the liquidation of your illusions. You will downsize. You will learn to live within your means. You will learn the value of $1, and more importantly, the value of peace of mind." "We will," Thomas said firmly, reaching out to grasp Jessica's hand. She squeezed it back tightly. "We'll list the house next week." "Good," Eleanor said. "Now regarding the $5 million. The air on the veranda seemed to grow completely still. "I have already transferred the entire sum into an irrevocable trust," Eleanor stated. A flicker of surprise crossed Thomas's face, but he remained quiet. "The trust is set up solely for Leo's future," Eleanor continued. "It will cover his education, his first home, and provide him with a safety net so he never has to make choices based on fear or desperation, the way you two have." Jessica let out a breath she had been holding. "Thank you. Eleanor, thank you so much for securing his future." "There is a condition," Eleanor said, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "I am the founder of the trust, but I am not the executor. If in the future you need to request funds for Leo's tuition, or a medical emergency, or anything else, you will have to formally submit that request to the trustees." "Who are the trustees?" Thomas asked, a sense of dawning realization washing over him. Eleanor smiled. It was a beautiful, devastating smile. "The trustees are your Uncle Joe and Martha." Jessica physically recoiled, her eyes going wide. Thomas's jaw dropped. "Martha?" Jessica whispered. The woman with the fruitcake?" "And Uncle Joe, the mechanic who tracks mud on your rugs," Eleanor confirmed, her tone perfectly pleasant. "They are the most honest, grounded people I know. They understand the value of hard work and family. They cannot touch the money for themselves, but they hold the keys to Leo's trust. If you ever want your son to benefit from Arthur's legacy, you will have to look the people you discarded in the eye. You will have to sit at their tables. You will have to rebuild the bridges you burned to ash." It was a masterstroke of justice. It wasn't revenge. It was a forced rehabilitation. Eleanor had engineered a scenario where Thomas and Jessica could no longer insulate themselves with wealth. To access the future, they had to embrace the roots they had tried to sever. Jessica looked down at her hands. The poetic justice of the situation was absolute. She looked up at Eleanor, and for the first time in her life, the tears in her eyes were tears of profound respect. "We'll buy Martha a new baking tin," Jessica whispered, a fragile, tentative smile touching her lips. I think I'd like to learn how to make that fruitcake." Eleanor walked over and placed a warm, weathered hand on Jessica's shoulder. "It's very sweet, Jessica, but it pairs wonderfully with a bitter cup of coffee. 1 year later, the house was much smaller. It was a modest 3-bedroom colonial in a quiet older neighborhood lined with oak trees. The kitchen countertops were Formica, not marble, and the driveway housed a sensible used sedan instead of imported luxury SUVs. But the house was warm. The scent of cinnamon and roasting apples filled the air, mingling with the smell of fresh pine. In the living room, a slightly crooked real Christmas tree was covered in an explosion of mismatched handmade ornaments. "Thomas, the oven is smoking," Jessica called out, laughing as she frantically waved a dish towel at the stove. She was wearing comfortable jeans and a slightly oversized sweater. The heavy makeup was gone, replaced by the natural, relaxed glow of a woman who was finally getting 8 hours of sleep a night. Thomas rushed in from the hallway, grabbing a pair of oven mitts and pulling a slightly charred tray of sausage rolls from the heat. "Salvageable. Completely salvageable," he declared, tossing one into his mouth and immediately regretting how hot it was. In the corner of the kitchen, sitting in a comfortable rocking chair, was Eleanor. She was calmly knitting a scarf, this one a bright, cheerful crimson. Leo ran into the room, wearing the navy blue sweater his grandmother had made him the year prior. He was holding a large, somewhat lopsided, brightly wrapped package. "Uncle Joe and Aunt Martha just pulled into the driveway," Leo shouted excitedly. "Uncle Joe brought his guitar." "Well, go help them with their bags, sweetheart," Eleanor smiled, her needles clicking rhythmically. Jessica walked over, wiping her hands on her apron, and leaned against the rocking chair. She looked around the small, chaotic, beautiful kitchen. She looked at her husband, who was happily scraping the burnt bottoms off the pastries, and her son, who was sprinting out the front door to hug his great-uncle. "You know," Jessica said softly, looking down at Eleanor, "I think the apple pie smells better in this kitchen than it ever did in the old house." Eleanor didn't look up from her knitting, but a warm, peaceful smile spread across her face. "That's because you're finally breathing the air, Jessica. It makes everything taste sweeter." The front door burst open, accompanied by a blast of cold winter air and Martha's booming, joyful laugh. The house filled with noise, with chaos, with the beautiful, imperfect symphony of a real family. Eleanor Vance kept knitting, the rhythmic clicking of her needles, a quiet testament to the enduring, unbreakable strength of a woman who knew her own worth. The screen fades to black, then cuts to the host of the YouTube channel sitting in a cozy, softly lit room with a mug of tea and a small, tasteful holiday wreath in the background. Host voiceover outro. And so, Eleanor's story ends not with a grand display of spite, but with the quiet, profound victory of a woman reclaiming her dignity. We often talk about wealth as if it's just numbers in a bank account, but this story reminds us that true wealth, the kind that survives the winter of our lives, is found in the respect we demand for ourselves and the boundaries we set with those we love. Jessica and Thomas had to lose their illusions to find their actual lives. And Eleanor? She taught us that turning the other cheek doesn't mean becoming a doormat. Sometimes the most loving thing a mother or a grandmother can do is allow her family to experience the uncomfortable consequences of their own actions. To all the women listening right now, especially those of you who have ever felt invisible in a room full of your own family, your life is not a background character's role in someone else's movie. Your wisdom, your resilience, and your love are the foundation of the house. Never apologize for taking up space, and never let anyone make you feel small so they can feel big. You hold the power to write your own next chapter. What did you think of Eleanor's masterstroke with the trust fund? Do you think Jessica truly changed, or is the road to redemption longer than a year? I want to read your thoughts, your experiences, and your own family stories down in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story brought you comfort, or perhaps a little bit of fire, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep sharing these journeys together. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Remember to protect your peace, and I will see you in the next story.